translator sat back from the keyboard and rubbed the back of her neck, sighing with a mix of the satisfaction of a job well done, relief at that job being finally finished, and wonder at the contents of the document she had just finished working with. She would soon present her findings to the world, after which everything would change. 15 years before, the child, with a passion for astronomy and a brand new top-of-the-line backyard telescope, a birthday gift from their uncle, had noticed an unusually bright spot lazily crawling its way around the outskirts of the solar system, and had written into the space agency to inquire about it. The researcher at the agency had been taking a break from the fruitless inquiry as to why the agency's last probe had vanished from scopes without warning a little more than a month ago. He often spent downtime reading and occasionally responding to such letters as the child's, and took an interest upon realizing that the child's data and observations, enclosed with a letter, though scrupulously detailed and carefully presented, didn't make the slightest bit of sense. The object was far too bright for it not to have been noticed before. It was at least as bright as the innermost gas giants, and yet, if there had been an additional planet out there all along, surely someone would have noticed it by now by its gravitational disturbance. Other planets and astronomical bodies had been discovered in exactly that manner, after all. The researcher hypothesized that perhaps an outer system comet or asteroid had recently been involved in a collision, possibly exposing a very high albedo core. Interesting enough to warrant further attention in the future, but not immediately. He wrote back to the child with his theory, mentioning that, should it turn out no one else had found the anomaly before, the child would be able to name it. Sending the letter, he added checking up on the object to a mental to-do list, and returned to the enquiry with a smiling face. Delighted with the prospect of naming a real heavenly body, the child wrote back immediately, claiming that if he could, he would like to name the object after his late beloved pet, who had passed away during the previous winter, and asking the researcher to very kindly, please enclose a photo of the object taken with one of the agency's big powerful telescopes, just as soon as they could, so as to see what it was a bit more clearly. The child never heard back. Upon receiving the child's reply, the smile returned. As it turned out, that very night was the researcher's arranged time to connect to the agency's biggest orbital telescope. Happy to hear of the next generation being so interested in astronomy, he decided to indulge the child's request and spend the last few minutes of time lining up the telescope to the anomaly to take a photograph or two. Expecting to see a broken comet a few kilometers wide, he was puzzled at the first photograph, which appeared totally black. Inspecting closer, there were 4 white pixels just to the left of center of the picture. Perhaps he'd broken something. Unsure as to exactly why, he zoomed in. Then there, filling the screen at a scale indicating that it was much smaller than it should have been, was the object. Barely a few meters across, it was mirror-shined iridescent blue and vaguely triangular. Whatever it was certainly no comet. It was artificial. After being hastily classified by the higher-ups, the space agency was tasked by the government to investigate the object, with a sizable off-the-books budget to do its work. The more it was investigated, the stranger it seemed. Its orbit around the sun was exactly circular, as far as measurements could observe, and precisely aligned with the plane of the ecliptic. Closer observation seemed to reveal a small cloud around the object, comprised of objects too small to pick out individually, or some kind of gas or dust cloud that made absolutely no sense to the team responsible for analyzing it with spectroscopy. The cloud seemed to cling to the object, less dispersed than it should otherwise be given the object's minuscule gravitational pull. Eventually, the agency repurposed one of its upcoming missions to instead send a probe to the object. As far as the public knew, the mission was to send the fastest uncrewed probe ever constructed to the outermost planet, where it would perform various analyses and send the data home. A third of the way through its mission, a year after launch and 5 years. Since the object was spotted by the child, the announcement was made by a gloomy-looking space agency official that something had gone terribly wrong during the craft's second gravitational slingshot maneuver around a gas giant, and the craft had been lost. It was quite the publicity hit for the agency, having lost 2 probes so close together, but it was necessary. In reality, it sped silently towards a rendezvous with the object. 7 months and 11 days later, the craft began a punishing deceleration maneuver, bleeding off its incredible velocity to come to a relative stop mere kilometers from the object. Decades later, the engineering team responsible for such a precise operation would be posthumously lauded as genius. Instead, they celebrated in secret. The probe spent the next month beaming reams of encrypted data back home. Scans and analyses in all parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, measurements of size, velocity, radiation output and anything else its onboard sensors could capture. What the data revealed stunned the investigation team into silence. The object was tetrahedral, with rounded corners, but sharp edges, a little over 10 meters to a side. 3 of the 4 faces were identical, the 4th with what seemed to be a black disk directly in the center. The otherwise pristine otherworldly surface of the object seemed to be damaged around the edge of the disk, with ugly-looking purple cracks radiating from it and covering most of that face. The previously unidentified cloud around the object appeared to be comprised of motes of dust, the same strange blue as the surface of the object. The substance baffled the analytical systems of the probe, but it collected what it could and streamed the data back to eager scientists in their labs. After the probe had collected and relayed as much information as it could remotely, the mission team sent it closer, so try to gather a sample of the object itself. There had been one harrowing moment when it looked like the probe would crash into it. When the probe had got within about 100 meters of the object, it suddenly began to accelerate. Later analysis had revealed that the object exerted an unusual gravitation attraction. That seemed to be equivalent to that of a small moon, but only at relatively short distances. While the mechanism puzzled the best minds for centuries, it at least explained the lack of dispersion in the dust cloud. Luckily, the probe originally designed to land on a foreign planet still had the automated software to correct the approach. While the onboard computer complained heartily about the event, disaster had been avoided. The object was just as strange at close range. The surface appeared to be perfectly smooth, with the sharp edges of the triangles honed to such a degree they would have been able to slice cleanly through granite. Up close, the blue of the hull was tinged with subtle greens that seemed to slowly undulate through the material just below the surface. It was also so hard as to instantly blunt the probe's main diamond-tipped drill, as well as the primary and secondary backups, before the order was given to abandon that particular endeavor. The side of the object with the black disk unanimously designated as the bottom of the object was more interesting. The sensor data from the probe indicated that the purple cracks were in face more like tendrils, radiating from the disk and emitting various exotic subatomic particles, most of which should not have been able to exist without decaying, but yet did so anyway. A light scraping by the probe's manipulator arms managed to pick some up, and it had the consistency of molten glass. To the dismay of the probe's engineering staff, the purple goop eroded through the manipulator arm in a few minutes, causing metal fatigue and snapping the arm off before a sample could be collected. This idea, too, was abandoned until a later mission could be sent with better equipment to collect a sample safely. Strangest of all was the black disk. Perfectly circular, about a meter in diameter, and so utterly black the probe's sensors had trouble seeing it at all. Nothing reflected off it, and it seemed to emit only a slightly higher concentration of the same mix of impossible subatomic particles as the purple goop. The investigation team instructed the probe to try to gather a sample, and collectively gasped when the video came back to them 15 hours later. The probe had gotten stuck in a loop halfway through the program, unsure what to do. On the video screen, the team saw the secondary manipulator arm of the probe, sunk to nearly a third of a meter into the black, seemingly sliced cleanly off at the boundary. They watched as the probe seemed to fumble around for a few seconds, unable to find something to sample, then pull the arm back, which rematerialized from the disk as it did so, before plunging the arm back in. Several days of heated discussion and various arguments later, the general consensus was that the disk was some sort of portal or doorway, perhaps to the inside of the object, perhaps to elsewhere, and the people in charge decided to send the entire probe to see what there was on the other side, carefully programmed with the hope that it would be able to re-emerge from the hole later. 6 hours after the probe entered the hole, it surfaced and began sending back enough data to keep the planet's brightest busy for months. The object was a spacecraft, that much was clear. Through the hole had been a large space, the same size and shape as the exterior. The probe reported the same moon-like gravity inside object, but rather than an attraction to the center of the object it now pulled to one side, giving the interior a distinct down. Despite the largely uniform appearance of the exterior, the interior was filled wall-to-wall with various high-tech display units and consoles that were a mix of conventional and holographic. One display, the size of a small tablet, showed what looked like a moving photograph of a city, with sparkling crystal towers reaching into a vermilion sky, with yellow grass swaying in the foreground. Another showed a diagram of the solar system, the third planet with a green circle around it. Given the amount of observation equipment that seemed to be present, it was surmised that this was a reconnaissance craft, likely sent to the system to quietly observe a native species. The probe found no evidence of it being a military craft, but with such alien technology in every sense of the word it couldn't be said for certain. What could be said for certain was that whatever the craft's mission to the system had been, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The space was dimly lit by an ominous deep purple light that gently pulsed. Most of the displays were off, or showing static or other garbled images. The same purple goop that appeared crack-like from the exterior of the craft was covering various surfaces inside, though whatever material the craft's components were made of seemed not to suffer the same fatiguing effects the metal of the probe had. It spidered out from a large scorch mark on the floor, at the center of which was a fractured hole into what appeared to be some kind of engineering crawl space. The most damning evidence of catastrophe, however, was that the display terminal with the picture of the city and the grass was held loosely by a diminutive pinkish tentacled creature in form-hugging white clothing. A creature that was, by no stretch of the imagination, clearly dead. With the news that the existence of alien life had not only been confirmed, but that there was actually had a dead alien floating around at the edge of the system, it was only a matter of time before the story was leaked out of the space agency. Despite the government's best attempts at censorship, the news swept the globe in hours. The news networks called in experts and conspiracy theorists, and astronomers and biologists and anyone else they could get a hold of. Religious leaders called upon their followers to pray for guidance, and several countries declared martial law, but that had turned out to be a largely unnecessary precaution. In every society there are those who would take advantage of chaos for their own benefit, but within a few days the entire planet had settled down into a kind of nervous, but excited, anticipation. After thousands upon thousands of years of wondering if life had evolved in only one place, there was now an answer. There were others, perhaps enemies but hopefully friends, out there in the cosmos. The species was no longer alone. With the existence of the investigation project now known by the public at large, and with general public approval of the project, the team was expanded to include more scientists and engineers, with specialties ranging from materials science to the suddenly booming field of astrobiology. Funding was approved for a new and longer mission, to attempt to actually escort the craft to a closer orbit where it could be studied in more detail. The first probe, while heroically doing its duty to deliver its data back through the hole and outside the spacecraft, had stumbled into one of the purple tendrils and stopped moving shortly thereafter. The next day, it stopped responding to commands from the space agency at all. Nevertheless, it had done the job of uniting the globe under a common goal: to learn about and one day meet beings from another world. Billions of dollars, and 6 years later, the first crewed spacecraft to visit the outer solar system had finished construction and was on its way. Several smaller probes had been sent to the object in the intervening time, but it seemed that getting an autonomous probe to avoid the purple tendrils with a light delay of more than 7 hours in each direction was more than could be done. Instead, the crew would explore the craft in person, tow it back to a closer orbit if possible, and learn whatever could be learned in the meantime. Using the most advanced propulsion techniques ever developed and a now almost unlimited budget, the crewed flight arrived in a matching orbit with the craft in another 3 years. While the world watched with bated breath, for the first time, physical contact would be made with an alien creature, even if only a dead one. The mission commander, accompanied by the mission specialist, disappeared through the hole and into the craft. After making sure the purple goop wouldn't eat through their suits, the crew members carefully took samples from the alien and from various materials within the craft and collected as many artifacts as they could that weren't physically connected to the superstructure of the craft. The goop seemed not to have any negative effect on ordinary plastic, and so samples were taken until the sample bags were full, and then the rest of it just pushed aside with a spatula from the crew kitchen to access whatever was underneath. Among the things retrieved from the craft were the handheld display, still showing the alien scenery, a small box with articulated legs that had been stuck under a layer of the goop, but as soon as it was freed started flitting about the craft until it could be caught. There was a stiff sheet of some metal so thin, it became invisible when viewed side on, but somehow had what looked and felt like an alien writing system embossed on both sides. They had also found, lying neatly on the floor near the dead alien, what looked like a leather-bound book, with a pen clipped into a special holder on the spine. Seeing such a mundane object in an alien spacecraft was something of a surprise to the mission commander, but he nonetheless picked it up. Carefully opening the book, the pages were covered in more of the alien writing, but this time using ink on paper, rather than embossed on strange metals. He slowly slipped the book and pen into a plastic sample bag and catalogued them. When the news of the book reached home, there was more speculation about it than any of the other artifacts recovered. For an alien race so apparently advanced, one paper and pen hopelessly outdated. It was pointed out that a book doesn't need to rely on a power source to work, and seeing as the craft seemed to be running in a low power or emergency mode, perhaps the occupant had wanted to record something that couldn't be entered on the ship's computer systems. Perhaps the book was a physical backup of some kind. The exterior remained too hard to sample, but a specially constructed clamp managed to hold onto the mirror-smooth surface tightly, enough to tug it back with them. Sunward 2 days later, the mission commander grew sick. 12 hours after that, he was dead. The mission specialist died not long after. It wasn't entirely unexpected, as introducing any kind of alien microbiology into a local biome had a contamination risk, but it had been prepared for. However, it wasn't microbiology that was the problem. The most in-depth scans available seemed to show that nothing was alive in the alien craft, from the cellular scale up. Dozens of tests and annoyingly light delayed video calls between the remaining crew and doctors back home finally provided the answer. The problem was the purple goop and its strange particle emission. Something about the particles it gave off was messing with cellular function in a way that no one could fully understand and went right through any hazmat or radiation suit the crew had. The only thing that seemed to stop the emissions was the iridescent skin of the craft. Simulations indicated that even a short line of sight exposure could be lethal. Exploration of the interior of the craft was immediately forbidden, and a surprisingly complex series of maneuvers to reorient the craft in its clamp. So the hole was facing away from the crewed ship was undertaken to minimize exposure to the particles emitted through the hole on the way home. Any samples that had already been collected were thrown back into the alien craft. While the crew dragged the craft home with them, the agency brought on hundreds more experts to pore over every little bit of data that was sent to them. They had been brought to the main headquarters of the space agency and had been personally greeted by the head of the agency before being assigned to a task and sent off to their respective teams. In the first months, excitement was high. Hundreds of alien artifacts and samples had been pulled from the ship before entering it had been forbidden, and those could still be studied. The largest team was working on a way to counter the effects of the goop on biology. They also had what was possibly the hardest job. Materials science simply wasn't advanced enough to answer the problem. They didn't know what the goop was, let alone how to get rid of it. The only protection to be had from the goop was the skin of the alien spacecraft, but it was too hard to collect samples or study more than superficially. The vast majority of the goop may have been inside the craft, but that was also where all the secrets of the universe may be hiding. If only the goop could be cleared, perhaps they would be able to reverse engineer the design of the craft and explore the furthest reaches of the galaxy. Other teams had it easier. The legged box turned out to be an advanced cleaning and maintenance robot. While trying to perform experiments with it, the engineer on the spaceship had accidentally dropped it, and it had zipped off and out of sight. It had been found 5 hours later, desperately trying to scrape the space agency logo off the wall in the corner of a storage compartment. Within a short while, it seemed to learn more about its new environment and calmed down a bit, restricting itself to mopping up spills and exactly aligning any loose object it could find with the walls of the room. The crew quietly agreed to keep it as a kind of useful pet for the journey home. It was, after all, kind of cute in its earnestness. The team responsible for the handheld display unit were at a complete loss. They got a crew member to poke at it like a touchscreen, and sometimes it seemed to respond while at others there was no discernible pattern to its actions. Sometimes it would display complicated-looking graphs, sometimes a large black symbol on a red circle, sometimes it would beep quietly, even when not touched. When left alone for a while, the screen would return to the crystalline towers of the alien city. The metal sheet was studied by 3 teams, working from different angles. There was a material science team, trying and failing to figure out what it was made of. There was a team of mathematicians and physicists trying to figure out how what seemed to be a genuinely two-dimensional object could actually exist, and struggling just as hard. There was also the translation team, working on the possible meaning of the symbols impossibly embossed on it. The translator, a true expert who spoke more than 36 languages and could write in half a dozen more, was the lead of the translation team. They had the metal sheet, a few still images from the few working screens left in the alien craft, and the book. Among all the teams, the translation team had the best resources, at least for now. They didn't need physical access to the writing. They could simply download scans of the originals and work with that. The team threw themselves into the work, cross-referencing thousands of symbols and their relative positions in the book, discussing what might have been a separate symbol from one found on the sheet, or just a variation between printed and written text. Translating a never-before-seen, never-heard language was difficult, but not impossible. Over the course of the next couple of years, excitement died down as the public slowly began to realize that the world would not be changing overnight. When the tow ship parked itself in a lunar orbit and the surviving crew returned home, parades were thrown, and the mission commander and specialist were given state funerals, empty caskets buried among heroes of the past. With the alien craft now finally at a more reasonable distance, teams of engineers flew to it for study, but the problem of the purple goop had not been solved. Public excitement spiked briefly, but shortly fell back into pessimism as no new breakthroughs occurred. For 2 more years, the translator worked at her task. Many people, disheartened by failure, left the space agency to work on more fulfilling problems. Public opinion began to slowly turn against the agency. There was still hope for the stars, but the public began to think that the space agency simply wasn't good enough at the job to be the ones in charge. Private individuals and companies began research into space exploration, with a view of sending signals and high-speed probes in every direction, shouting to the void of their presence and the wish to be met. Eventually, the translator was the only person still working on the translation team. Very little progress had been made. Okay, they live long enough. Good thing they've progressed past copper and tin, though. I'm reminded of a story my mentor told me. One of his first new meets was a short-lived race that only had locally available materials for a Type 2. Their diplomatic envoy to the council would have had to be a generation ship if the council hadn't made an exception and sent them a more advanced ship. I'm dead. I'm not sure what happened, but almost immediately after dropping to subluminal, I hit something head-on. I don't even know how that could happen. It's all but mathematically impossible to hit something in space unless you try to. The ship managed to auto-stabilize before the engines cut out completely, but that's about the only good news. The bad news is that the fuel gel tank ruptured. There's a massive grate hole in the floor on top of where the tank used to be, and it's gone everywhere. There's nothing I can do. The only thing on this ship that can contain it now the tank's gone is the ship itself. The ship where I am. Where the air is. To top things off, the comms are down. Everything's down. I can't call for help. Even if I could, I'd be long dead before anyone got here. I'm dead. Okay, let's take stock. No communications. No engines. Starting to run low on power. No control of ship systems. I can't even get into the computer to make a log entry. I'm stranded on the edge of a barely spacefaring solar system on the edge of the galaxy. I've received a lethal dose of exotic radiation, and the closest place with a cure is a third of the way to the galactic core. I have enough air in emergency bottles for a couple of spacewalks outside the ship away from the radiation, but even if I could stay outside indefinitely, it wouldn't stop what I've already got from killing me. My last communication home was just after I left, leaving an awful lot of space to cover for a rescue, or more likely, recovery, operation. I couldn't even get in touch with the locals, even if I'd finished analyzing the language yet. Unless someone happens to spot me, which would be impossible with the stealth stuck on, no one knows where I am. This will be the last entry in this diary. I write it with sadness and resignation, but also with hope and determination. I can't access the computer, so this is written partly as a final log, but also in the hope that the local civilization finds me and can understand my purpose here, and why I was unable to fulfill my duty in a more conventional manner. This is written for you, the inhabitants of this system. Power is running low, and I estimate that within a few of your days, the stealth composite on my ship will critically drain power reserves. And my ship will become visible to you. I am in a very wide orbit, but I have hope you'll make it here. The field gel spread around the ship is incompatible with life, and will remain dangerous for about 30 of your years, so I can offer only my deepest sympathies to anyone who lost their lives before you learn this fact. I hope this will answer some of the questions you have. You are not alone. Our galaxy is teeming with life, with thousands of intelligent species from hundreds of worlds, as part of a huge cooperative community. I work for an interstellar organization that seeks out life among the stars, in memory of those we call the Ancients. We discovered your civilization during exploration some years ago, and I was sent here to be your first contact with the galaxy at large. Had things gone differently, I would have introduced myself and provided you with plans to build your own ship capable of traveling to the Galactic Council, who would have welcomed you with open arms. For now, you'll have to wait for my replacement, which could take several decades. I've been unable to contact my organization, so you'll have to wait for them to realize I've not checked in, and for them to send someone looking. Until then, I can share with you the reason for our mission. We were tasked by the Ancients to seek out friendship with life among the stars, and to share this story. When the universe was born, there was no life. When it was young, the first cellular life formed, and in its adolescence, the first civilization rose up, the Ancients. The Ancients were curious, and clever, and lonely. They studied and became masters of the elements. They traveled the universe and performed miracles. But they were lonely. All species have an inherent loneliness when they look into the night sky, longing to not be alone in the universe. But as the first, the Ancients were truly alone. You are not alone. The Ancients, saddened by their empty universe, seeded life throughout this galaxy and others. Life, however, takes billions of years to develop into new civilizations, and by the time the first of us rose into the sky, the Ancients had long since departed to unknown regions of space, or perhaps elsewhere still. Instead, they left behind technology, totems, and markers to let the new lifeforms know that they were not alone, as the Ancients had been. You are not alone. The Ancients charged their children to make sure that none of their sibling races would feel the same loneliness that had, the loneliness intrinsic to every uncomforted soul. And so that is my purpose here. You are not alone. You may know the Ancients by another name. Most civilizations have some knowledge of them, or a name for them. My race calls them Ancients. Others call them Forerunners, or those who came before, or the first, or the gods. Some know them, but choose not to name them. Know that the galaxy will welcome you with open arms of brotherhood in their name, whatever you choose to call them. If you have no name for them, then my last gift to you is their own name, in their own tongue. Humanity. Author's name and the link to original text in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video. And please join our channel.